Alright, sorry for the abrupt cutoff last time. I was just about to go over what I think is still the YouTube time limit. So, moving on. Last time we just created a very basic age property. Now, this is still, the C# designers decided this is still too much to write for this functionality. And you'll see, actually, this is recommending that we convert it to an auto property. So if we do that, look at that. All we have to do all that stuff we did in Java before is just we make a property like this, and we just say get set. If we want this to be get only, like we want a read-only variable, we can supply only a get. And you can see it's not letting us set it anymore because, as you can see down here, we're only allowed to get it. And in fact, if we see .age, there's only a green arrow here because we're only allowed to get it. So we'll leave set in there as well. But look at how much smaller and cleaner this is. In fact, .NET 4.6 allows us to do fun things like add default values like this. But we're not using 4.6. So actually, this is a C#6 feature, so we might actually be able to use this with .NET 4.5 and have it compile down. But this is one of the nice themes that we'll notice in C#, is it's very similar to Java, but we take a lot of things that would usually be a lot of boilerplate, and we just smush them down into smaller and smaller pieces. And this is still quite readable, you know. We have a public integer age, and we can get it and we can set it. We can see that this is a property. Now, let me teach you one of my favorite things about classes like this. So first off, whenever you want to learn something new about C# and you're writing basically Java code and you have ReSharper installed, one thing you can do is look for underlines like this. So this is recommending that we use var, simple types. So what we can do with C# is we can declare anything, any variable, with var over here. And what this will do is it'll let the compiler determine what type this actually is. Now, you know, this is kind of a minor convenience for person here because, you know, person isn't very hard to type out. But if we had something like, you know, a list of dictionaries that contain, I don't know, integers and IO exceptions, that can be a pretty long qualifier. And saying that twice can really push your width over to the side. So it's nice to have this on the side so you don't have to repeat redundant information. I recommend limiting your use of this to when the type is extremely obvious, like this, and we're saying new person on the other side. Because otherwise, if I don't know, like, if a function returns something, then I might not know what that returns, and I'd have to hover over this guy and see that he's a person. And that's just an extra step that shouldn't be necessary from the consumer perspective. Now, another cool thing about C# is object initializers. So whenever we have a public field like this that can be get and set, this is going to recommend we use an object initializer, so let's let ReSharper do its thing. So what we can do is we can take each property and we can set it individually like this. So what this means is if we have, say, a public string name, and we wanna set the person's name as well, all we have to do, see, and it shows us the properties that we can set. We'll say name is Steve. So what this saves us is if we have a bunch of public properties like this, we don't have to create a bunch of constructors for them. We could have our default constructor, which, as you can see, ReSharper grays out because it's not doing anything useful. And we can set our age equal to 0 and our name equal to nothing. We could have a public person that takes in an int, and we could have this say age equals age, name equals that, and so on, but we don't have to do that because we can do the object initializer. That's not to say that constructors are useless in C#. For example, if we wanted age to be a get-only value, then we can't use the object initializer up here because this depends on get and set being both public and defined. Now, let me show you a nicer way you can do this, because you can see right here, I have name, and I have name, and that's kind of gross. Now, the Java way of doing this would have you calling a common constructor like this. And you would call the constructor in the body here. C# is a little bit different. It borrows more from C++ syntax. So what we have is sort of a constructor inheritance. So what you do is you use the C++ syntax of using a colon, and see, we can also extend a base constructor if we want to, but we're going to extend this. So notice we're not saying person again, because as we've already said, C# hates repeating itself. So we're going to say this, and we can set our age, and we can set our default value here. Very nice. And as you can see, we can do the same thing with our default constructor. And if you wanted, we could even extract these into, you know, private static variable somewhere. So constructors work more or less the same that they would. So how would this actually work? What if I wanted to do more work in here? A good way, if you don't know how these things sort of work, is to just put print statements everywhere. But what this would do is when we construct a person, whenever we see this extension, just like when you have a base class and an extended class, it'll call the base class constructor first. It'll call this constructor first. So this is the same thing as basically taking this guy and copy-pasting it right here. Of course, we would have to take the parameters in here as well and give it an int age. But this is basically just this. And you see that we're redefining it, and that's why it's complaining. So that's what constructor inheritance looks like in C#. Okay, we'll leave this as our regular old basic constructor here like this. And of course, this isn't a well-designed class, this isn't a beautiful class, but it's an example class. So as a quick recap, we learned about the var keyword that lets the compiler figure out what we need to do. We learned about object initializers, which allow us to use braces like this to set all public properties like that. And note that this calls the default constructor before it does any of this. Keep that in mind. The default constructor is still being called. We learned a little bit more about auto properties, and we learned about constructor chaining. That concludes this video. I think next time we'll talk a little bit about... we'll just see where it goes.